This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Iran threatens war after the Islamic Republic accuses Israel of attacking its nuclear facility. Plus, the Green Pass, privileges for the vaccinated or discrimination against those who aren't. Plus, a rare discovery unites ancient history and the Gospels in the modern state of Israel. And Israelis celebrate their country's 73rd Independence Day. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Iran announced it has begun to enrich uranium up to 60%, just shy of weapons grade. Iran's President Rouhani says they can reach weapons grade if they want to. His threat comes after Iran's key nuclear facility mysteriously lost power. That severely damaged Iran's ability to enrich uranium. It's raised the stakes significantly between the Jewish state and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran is blaming Israel for the attack, and a leading Iranian official is warning of war.
We want to say very frankly to all those who want to implement sabotages on us that if they attempted to start wars, Iran would not keep silent.
According to the New York Times, the power outage at the Natanz nuclear facility set back Iran's nuclear program at least 9 months. Israeli media is reporting the Mossad is behind a cyber attack that damaged advanced centrifuges just hours after they went online. Last July, Iran blamed Israel for an explosion that severely damaged this facility. Sunday's incident raises the stakes in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran. Another confrontation is taking place on the high seas. Israel attacked an Iranian ship off the coast of Yemen recently, while Iran hit an Israeli vessel a few weeks ago. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu encouraged the Israel Defense Forces to continue its battle against Iran.
The fight against Iran and its proxies, the fight against Iran's nuclear program, the fight against Iran's nuclearization is a huge task. And I wish all of us that you continue on this path and that you continue to keep the sword of David, in your hands.
Here in Israel, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met with both Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Benny Gantz.
The Tehran of today poses a strategic threat to international security, to the entire Middle East, and to the state of Israel.
During our meeting, I reaffirmed to Minister Gantz our commitment to Israel is enduring and it is ironclad.
While the fight between Israel and Iran grows, negotiations in Vienna between Iran and the 5 nations that signed the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal continue. The talks are designed to help the U.S. re-enter the Iranian nuclear deal. Iran demands the U.S. act first by removing sanctions before it will agree to make any moves limiting its nuclear advancement. Last week on Holocaust Remembrance Day, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared Israel would not be bound by any nuclear deal. Here in Israel, after more than a year, Israel will open its skies to small groups of vaccinated tourists starting in May. That's because Israel is moving to revive its economy now that more than half the population has received both doses of the COVID vaccine. But a major part of that recovery includes a controversial Green Pass. The so-called passport is being offered only to those fully vaccinated or who have recovered from COVID-19.
Either get the vaccine or avoid certain kinds of risky interactions with others.
Only the passport holders will be allowed to eat inside restaurants, go to the gym and swimming pool, enter houses of worship, attend other various events, and fly into the country without quarantining.
If someone decides not to get the vaccine, they are within their right to do so. But it's also true that they should be the ones who bear the cost of this poor decision.
Those without a Green Pass can also have a negative PCR test a maximum of 72 hours before an event. Tourists must have a negative PCR test before boarding the plane to Israel, and when they land as well, have a serology test at Ben Gurion Airport to prove they've been vaccinated. Israel is working with other countries to find a method for recognizing each other's vaccines. Some feel the Green Pass program is government overreach and possibly illegal.
The WHO and most of the governments in the world so far, certainly the United States, has not adopted this measure. Even if you want to vaccinate, one has to be careful in not forcing vaccination.
Renowned immunologist Dr. Zvi Bentwich of Ben-Gurion University is part of the Emergency Public Council for the coronavirus crisis. The group, comprised of doctors, scientists, and others, have filed a lawsuit with the Supreme Court, calling the Green Pass coercive and predatory.
We are not against vaccination, but we are against the usage of a measure that would cause discrimination and enforcement of measures that would impinge on basically on human rights.
Professor David Enoch at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem disagrees.
When done properly, it does not violate human or civil rights. Giving at least a fairly successful vaccination effort, Green Passport policy is the way to do that.
Having a policy, let's say in restaurants, that everybody will wear a mask and there would be some sort of distancing, but by saying that you cannot enter a place unless you have this passport, that's a different story.
Many Israelis hope that once herd immunity is achieved, green passes and other restrictions will be unnecessary, so life can just return to normal. Meanwhile, these passports will rule the day. Coming up, a rare discovery at the Tower of David Museum unites ancient history and the Gospels in the modern state of Israel. A major renovation at Jerusalem's Tower of David Museum has led to a rare discovery. It represents another example of modern-day Israel bringing both ancient history and the Gospels to life. Those who enter the Old City through the historic Jaffa Gate are welcomed by the visually striking Tower of David Museum. Here at the Tower of David Museum, they discovered the foundations of King Herod's palace. These stairs lead down to the pools of his elaborate complex. And many historians and theologians believe it was at this palace that Jesus was brought before King Herod and Pontius Pilate.
Right near us, the excavation of the Kishle, you can find the foundation of this palace. We have the pool, the foundation, the Fatzael Tower, so we probably know that Jesus was here during his time in Jerusalem.
And it was here that renovations led to the discovery of this rare silver Tyre coin.
This is a very strong coin, very heavy silver. That's why it's so rare. Jerusalem is full of treasures, and this is one of them.
This coin was likely used to pay the temple tax during the reign of King Herod. Elat Lieber, the director of the museum, told CBN News the discovery brings the story of the Gospels alive.
And we know from the Gospels that Jesus visited Jerusalem. We know that he talked to the money changers. So here we have the evidence, the archaeological evidence, to the historical sources.
Another major part of the renovation is the Faisal Tower built by King Herod. Yotam Carmel heads up the conservation project.
It's important nationally, I think, internationally, and also personally, but to really touch this kind of structure is moving for me. Trying to preserve something and actually let it live on for future generations, and actually to do the best which is possible to keep as much original fabric as possible.
Carmel says the work Herod envisioned and ordered is exquisite.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's hard to understand how they lift, how they build, and how long it will last. I mean, it will last for thousands of years more. Unbelievable building system. Hard to get your mind around it, how it was done. It was just a massive scale of stone carving and building, which is very rare to see.
In 37 BC, Herod established himself as king of Judea and began some of the most ambitious building projects in the ancient world. including the reconstruction of the Second Temple. He transformed the city of Jerusalem so much that Pliny the Elder wrote, Jerusalem was by far the most distinguished city, not in Judea only, but of the whole Orient. Lieber says the Tower of David Museum connects the ages.
You can see how the past, the present, and the future are actually here at the Tower of David. And we can actually know more about our identity. Christians can see how the Gospels are coming alive here in Jerusalem.
She says their goal is to tell Jerusalem's story.
This is the most exciting part of our works because all we want is to bring Jerusalem to the world, the story of Jerusalem, the rich history of all of us, Jewish people, Christians from all over the world.
The coin will be part of the new exhibition at the Tower of David Museum, while the renovation work will continue for more than a year. Up next, a declaration in a Tel Aviv art gallery 73 years ago that changed the world. Israel celebrated its 73rd Independence Day with life looking almost normal after last year's coronavirus lockdown. Here's a story we did on the 70th anniversary about the declaration made in a Tel Aviv art gallery that changed the world forever. Against overwhelming odds, this fledgling state of Israel not only survived, but grew beyond expectation. CBN Scott Ross looks back at that moment along with someone who was there.
הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל היא מדינת ישראל.
Here in Independence Hall, David Ben-Gurion declared the birth of the modern state of Israel. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people had a nation.
He chose the words, we hereby declare the establishment, it says here, of a Jewish state in the land of Israel to be known as the State of Israel. This was the birth of a Jewish state, as for all Jews. Ben-Gurion was standing here as the voice of 11 million Jews around the world who had no voice, who had no address, and nowhere to go to.
I spoke with Isaac Dror, who leads the education effort here.
It was promised to us by God. We are the only people in the history of the world that live on the same land, speak in the same language, and believe in the same God more than 3,000 years.
We're in a historic setting here. Where are we and what happened?
This is the room where the Jewish state of Israel was born 70 years ago. In this tiny room with these same furnitures, a ceremony that lasted 32 minutes and shook the world.
As British rulers left Israel that day, 5 Arab armies invaded.
So it's like when you mix the happiest day for the Jewish people, one of the greatest moments for our nation in modern times, with one of the most dangerous and sad days when Israel was that close to a complete annihilation.
Why this building? Why here? Why Tel Aviv?
This building was simply the safest auditorium in the city of Tel Aviv.
Who were the people that were here?
Most of them people from around Tel Aviv, because they could not invite people from Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was disconnected. Only 350 of them were lucky enough to be squeezed in the room with no air conditioning.
And among the crowd of witnesses was Yael Sharet.
Her father was on the stage here, Moshe Sharet. He was the right hand of Ben-Gurion and the kind of the foreign minister of the provisional government of Israel.
I met Yael Sharet Medini at her home near Tel Aviv.
Here is my aunt, and this is my forehead. Hopefully there's something behind it, as I say, and we share the chair there, next to the wall.
She told me how just the day before, her father dictated and Yael wrote a draft of the Declaration of Independence.
This is my father's version of the Declaration. The one that he dictated to me, this is my handwriting. This is a photocopy of the original. Yeah. The original is in the archive.
Yael simply calls herself a handmaiden of history. Do you remember the event itself when Ben Gurion stood up and read?
It's epic. It's really epic. It's poetry, actually. The only time I was really moved, I must say, was when the Rabbi Levine made the old age Jewish blessing, Shechianu v'kiyimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh.
That ancient Jewish prayer, recited on momentous occasions, thanks God who has given us life, sustained us, and allowed us to reach this day.
I'm not religious, but this blessing has an echo of generations.
Did you sing?
Atikva, yes. And then everybody stood up, and it was the anthem, the national anthem.
The very next day, which was the Sabbath, President Harry Truman became the first world leader to recognize Israel.
The Pentagon and the State Department truly believed that Ben Gurion, the leader of Israel, is leading the world into a new catastrophe. One person, however, thought differently. His name was Harry Truman. He understood something that most of his top advisors and ministers failed to see. This is truly a prophecy being realized.
70 years later, it's clear that Truman was right.
Still ahead, God-fulfilling prophecy in the land of milk and honey. As Israel faces trouble on nearly every side, and even sometimes from within, it's important to remember how God is fulfilling His promises to the Jewish people. Julie Stahl has more on how biblical prophecy is coming to pass.
In the Bible, God promises the Jewish people a land flowing with milk and honey. And while it's a sign of abundance, it's also literal.
In fact, milk and honey is critical. It's used 20 times in Scripture.
But when the Jewish people returned from 2,000 years in exile, they found a barren desert land. And Orthodox Jewish author Moshe Kempinski says that was all in God's plan.
God says, I'm going to do something miraculous. I'm going to create a land that even though those climate issues don't call for it, it's going to be a land that's going to be filled also with dates and honey and also with milk, so that you know that nothing comes here. Nothing in this land comes here except when it's from me.
And God has delivered on that promise.
We consider leaders in that production of milk in the world.
Despite the heat, humidity, and limited resources, the Israeli cow produces more milk per year than cows in the U.S., European Union, and Australia.
We keep going up.
Ronen Gal manages operations for the dairy at Kibbutz Yotvata, the largest milking facility of its kind in the country.
The milk production in Israel is very clever. It's very high-tech.
And what about the honey? Most believe honey in Bible times probably came from date trees. Botanist Dr. Elaine Salaway emigrated from the U.S. and settled not far from Yotvata on Kibbutz Keturah in 1974.
Actually, I started out here as the head of the orchard branch. And of course, that was kind of funny because at that time we didn't have any orchards. So in the first few years, I was responsible for planting them. And the first orchard I planted was the date orchard, which you can see behind us, which is the main agricultural branch of the kibbutz.
There are tens of thousands of acres of date trees in Israel. Salaway planted some 3,000 of those trees here. This date orchard is here at Kibbutz Keturah in the Arava Desert. Each one of these trees produces about 350 pounds of dates a year. Salaway even managed to sprout a 2,000-year-old date seed found by archaeologists years ago at Masada. Nicknamed Methuselah, the tree is now 5 years old. Dates and palms were important in the scriptures, and dates from this area were known throughout the ancient world.
The Romans had nothing nice to say about the Jews, except that they had good dates. And their emperors actually used to order Judean dates to eat. And there were some very, very good date varieties in that day. They were famous through the known world.
Today, Israel's dates are still famous throughout the world. Israel exports some 12,000 tons of dates each year to 20 countries. Now, Salaway is going beyond dates to grow other life in the desert.
I'm looking for trees that love to live in the desert, that rejoice to live in the desert, not the ones I have to keep on life support.
She found clues in the Bible.
Well, the biblical trees, if they grew here in the old days, why shouldn't they grow here now? We reintroduced frankincense and myrrh, which had probably been introduced at the time of King Solomon. According to what we can tell from folk tales and from the Bible, there was already an incense and a medicinal tree being cultivated here called the balm of Gilead.
The frankincense and myrrh brought to Jesus were probably in crystal form like this. According to Kempinski, the revival of trees in the land is the first sign of redemption.
Ezekiel 36 says, "Mountains, shoot forth your branches, give forth your fruit, because my children are coming home." That's an unusual thing for God to tell a tree. That's what he created a tree to do. Except God is saying in Leviticus, I said it's going to be a desolate land when I kick you out. But watch, when I bring my people back home, this land is going to come forth with blossoms and trees and fruits.
So, he says, every date you eat and every glass of milk you drink here is like prophecy being fulfilled. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Kibbutz Keturah, Israel.
By the way, Julie's story on how biblical prophecy is coming to pass is our most popular story ever. And as Israel and the world face troubles from almost every direction, it's important to remember that God is still at work fulfilling His word. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blasts so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.